In a time when human lives were traded like livestock, a single heart, barely out of childhood, was dealt a cruel hand, destined for a barren landscape of endless dust and forgotten dreams. A silent transaction, cold and unforgiving, had sealed her fate. She was just 19, a tender age to be severed from all she had ever known, her very existence reduced to a commodity, weighed and measured by men whose gazes held no flicker of human kindness. The air itself seemed to press down on her, thick with the scent of fear and the unspoken grief of 1,000 stolen futures. Her breath caught, a ragged thing in her throat, as the final gavel struck, a sound that reverberated through her bones, declaring her the property of a man she had never seen, a white rancher whose reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. Alara stood, a slender silhouette against the brutal setting sun, her spirit, a fragile vessel buffeted by waves of despair. Her eyes, once bright with the simple joys of youth, were now shadowed pools reflecting only the vast, indifferent sky. She remembered the whisper of the old woman, her grandmother, a faint memory from long ago, speaking of roots that run deep, roots that no storm could truly tear away. But now, she felt rootless, adrift in a world that had suddenly turned vast and hostile. The wagon ride to the ranch had been a blur of jolting discomfort and stifling silence, punctuated only by the creak of the wheels and the distant cries of unseen birds. Each revolution of the spokes seemed to twist another knot of dread in her stomach, drawing her closer to an unknown prison. The ranch was a desolate spread, a collection of weather-beaten shacks huddled around a grander, forbidding house, all dwarfed by the endless expanse of parched land that stretched to the horizon like a scarred canvas. The air hung heavy with the smell of dust and the metallic tang of something old and unyielding. She felt the weight of countless unseen eyes upon her, a silent judgment from the land itself, as if it knew the indignity she carried. Her journey had stripped her of more than just her freedom. It had peeled away layers of naive hope, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. The ranch house loomed, a silent, unblinking eye observing her arrival, promising a future as bleak and unyielding as the very earth beneath her feet. She clutched the worn shawl around her shoulders, a flimsy shield against the cold certainty that had settled in her heart, a cold that seeped deeper than the evening chill. This was not a new chapter. It was the abrupt, violent tearing out of pages, leaving only blank, unwritten spaces. The rancher, Mr. Silas Thorne, was a man carved from the same hard earth as his land. His face was a landscape of deep furrows, his eyes the color of a winter sky, holding no warmth, only a calculating gaze that seemed to strip away the very essence of a person, leaving only their utility behind. He had surveyed Alara with a cold, appraising look upon her arrival, a look that had made her skin crawl, the unspoken implication of ownership hanging heavy in the air between them. He spoke few words, his voice a low rumble, but each syllable carried the weight of unquestionable authority, a sound that resonated with the power he wielded over every soul on his desolate spread. Her assigned duties were clear, though unspoken. A life of ceaseless toil, tending to his sprawling household, her hands destined to grow calloused, her spirit to wither under the relentless sun and the colder gaze of her new master. The silence of the ranch was a living thing, a constant companion that swallowed sounds and amplified thoughts, leaving her alone with the echoing chambers of her own fear. Days bled into weeks, each one a stark repetition of the last. The rhythm of her new life was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, punctuated by the rancher's sporadic appearances, always watchful, always imposing. Alara moved through the sprawling, dust-choked house like a ghost, her movements precise, her presence deliberately muted. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow stretching across the sun-baked walls, seemed to hold a silent judgment. She learned to anticipate the rancher's whims, to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight tightening around his eyes that signaled his displeasure. Her world had shrunk to the confines of this isolated property, where hope struggled to breathe amidst the parched earth and the crushing weight of her servitude. She clung to fragmented memories, shards of a past life that flickered like dying embers in the vast darkness of her present, offering scant warmth. The face of her mother, her laughter, the scent of wild jasmine from their small, forgotten garden thieves, were the whispers that kept the finality of her situation at bay, even as they pierced her with a familiar ache. It was during these endless days that Alara first noticed him, a figure as solitary as a lone sentinel against the vast, indifferent sky. He was a quiet black cowboy, tall and lean, his skin the color of rich, dark soil, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as if he carried the wisdom of the earth in his very gait. He worked the horses, broke the wild ones, his hands steady, his gaze unwavering. He rarely spoke, his silence deeper than anyone else's on the ranch, a silence that felt different, not empty but full of unspoken history. He was not like the others, the few scattered workers who toiled under Thorn's eye. Their spirits bowed, their voices hushed. This cowboy, whose name she soon heard whispered as Jeremiah, carried himself with a quiet dignity, an almost defiant grace that set him apart. He moved like a shadow, often appearing and disappearing without a sound, a phantom presence on the fringes of her new, bleak existence. His eyes, when they occasionally met hers across the dusty expanse of the yard, held a peculiar depth, a silent question she couldn't quite decipher, a spark of something she hadn't seen in anyone else since her arrival. Perhaps an echo of understanding, or a glimmer of something more unsettling, a hint of danger. The quiet black cowboy, Jeremiah, became a recurring motif in the stark tapestry of Alara's days. She observed him from the periphery of her demanding chores, a figure of intriguing contradiction against the harsh backdrop of the ranch. He moved with an effortless power, his muscles coiling and releasing as he wrangled horses. His hands, though calloused, possessed a surprising tenderness when he stroked a mare's flank. There was an unspoken language between him and the animals, a mutual respect that she found herself envying. He didn't speak to her, not directly, but his presence was a strange comfort, a silent anchor in a world that sought to unmoor her completely. Sometimes, their eyes would meet across the vast, dusty expanse of the ranch yard, a fleeting connection that lasted only a heartbeat, yet it held more substance than any shouted command from the rancher. In those brief moments, she felt a flicker of recognition, as if he saw not merely a possession, but a human soul, scarred yet still beating. One sweltering afternoon, as Alara toiled in the stifling kitchen, the smell of cooked meats and stale sweat clinging to the air, she heard a commotion outside. A young colt had broken free, bolting towards the thorny scrubland, and Thorn's voice, sharp and furious, rent the air. Jeremiah, without a word, had simply mounted his horse, a dark blur against the setting sun, and ridden out. He returned hours later, the colt safely tethered, his face streaked with dust, but his gaze as calm and resolute as ever. No triumph, no self-congratulation, just a quiet completion of a task. This quiet competence, this unassuming strength, began to chip away at the layers of Alara's despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a subtle shift, a recognition that not all strength on this ranch belonged to the cruel or the loud. His silence was not empty. It was a vast, deep reservoir of something she couldn't name. It carried a different kind of authority, one born not of ownership, but of innate capability and an almost primal understanding of the world. A tremor of a memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through Alara's consciousness. Her own father, his hands calloused from the field, but his eyes always soft when he looked at her. He had taught her to distinguish the rustle of dry leaves from the whisper of wind, to read the intentions of the sky from the clouds. He had promised her a life of quiet dignity, a small plot of land where she could grow whatever she pleased. The image of her father, a man of quiet strength, overlapped with the silent figure of Jeremiah, creating a dissonance in her mind. Was this cowboy a similar spirit, or merely another cog in the rancher's unforgiving machine? The question lingered, an open loop in her thoughts. She found herself watching him more closely, searching for clues, for a hint of the man beneath the stillness. His face, often obscured by the brim of his worn hat, held a rugged handsomeness, but it was his eyes that truly held her attention, dark, observant, and carrying the weight of untold stories, like ancient stones weathered by time and sorrow. There was a story there, she knew, buried deep within the silent folds of his existence, a narrative as potent and unspoken as her own. She began to sense a faint undercurrent of defiance in his quiet presence, a subtle resistance to the suffocating oppression that permeated every corner of the ranch. The routine of the ranch was a monotonous hum, a constant grinding that threatened to wear away Ilara's very soul. Each sunrise brought the same chores, the same dusty paths, the same chilling silence from the rancher. But within this oppressive sameness, the quiet presence of Jeremiah began to subtly alter the landscape of her internal world. She found herself subconsciously seeking him out, not for conversation, for there was none, but for the peculiar solace his grounded stillness offered. He was a man of the land, intimately connected to its harsh rhythms, yet he seemed to stand apart from the cruelty that festered upon it. He never laughed, never jested with the other workers, who themselves moved like shadows, their spirits crushed by their own unending servitude. Jeremiah was a sentinel of solitude, yet his solitude felt different, almost self-imposed, a chosen quietude rather than a forced one. One evening, as Ilara was carrying a heavy bucket of water from the well, her arms aching, her shoulders protesting with every strained step, her foot caught on a loose stone. The bucket tilted, spilling precious water onto the parched earth. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, the sound echoing in the vast quiet of the twilight. Before she could right herself, a shadow fell over her. Jeremiah stood there, silent as ever, his hand already reaching for the bucket. Without a word, he steadied it, then lifted it effortlessly, taking the weight from her grasp. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting moment, a spark of unexpected warmth in the cool evening air. His eyes, dark as midnight, met hers. There was no pity, no judgment, only a deep, unreadable understanding. He nodded once, a barely perceptible gesture, then continued on his way towards the stables, the heavy bucket hanging from his hand as if it were a feather. Ilara stood frozen, the phantom touch of his fingers lingering on her skin, a sensation both foreign and unsettlingly intimate. It was the first act of unsolicited kindness she had received since her arrival, a small gesture that spoke volumes in the crushing silence of her new life. This small, almost accidental interaction became a powerful symbol for Ilara. It was a crack in the granite wall of her despair, a brief glimpse of shared humanity. It ignited a fragile, dangerous hope within her, a realization that she was not entirely alone, not completely invisible. The incident replayed in her mind, a silent film of unspoken exchange, the weight of the water, the brush of hands, the silent, knowing glance. It was an anomaly in the harsh logic of the ranch, a moment of uncalculated grace that felt both vital and terrifying. She began to question the rigid boundaries of her fate, to wonder if the confines of her world were as absolute as they appeared. This man, Jeremiah, seemed to hold within him a different kind of power, one that didn't rely on whips or threats, but on a quiet, unwavering resolve. It was a subtle shift in the narrative of her suffering, a delicate thread of possibility woven into the coarse fabric of her daily existence. The rancher's cruel irony lay in his belief that he had bought a body. He had forgotten the resilience of the human spirit, especially when confronted with the silent defiance embodied by Jeremiah. The quiet encounter by the well deepened the unspoken connection between Ilara and Jeremiah. Her observations of him became more acute, more invested. She noticed the way his gaze lingered on the distant horizon, a hint of something restless, untamed, behind the calm facade. She saw the lines of weariness etched around his eyes, lines that spoke not of exhaustion from labor, but from a deeper, internal struggle. He was a man who carried burdens unseen, much like herself. His presence began to feel like a faint, persistent melody in the dissonance of her life, a promise of rhythm, however fragile. The air between them, once thick with unspoken tension, now hummed with a different kind of current, a quiet understanding, forged in the crucible of shared oppression. This subtle bond was a dangerous thing on Thorne's ranch, a seed of defiance planted in barren soil. One dusty morning, as Ilara was sweeping the porch, a gust of wind caught a loose board, sending it clattering. Jeremiah, passing by with a coil of rope, paused. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Was it concern, or perhaps a warning? He didn't speak, but his gaze shifted to the ranch house, then back to her, a silent message passing between them. The message was clear. There was danger, not just in the visible forms of the rancher's temper, but in the insidious, pervasive nature of the place itself. The very stones held memories of cruelty. A shiver, unrelated to the morning chill, ran down her spine. The air grew thick with unspoken words, a language of apprehension that only they seemed to share. It was as if he was acknowledging the invisible chains that bound them both, not just the visible ones. Later that week, Ilara overheard fragments of conversation among the other workers, hushed whispers that spoke of Thorn's mounting debts, his ruthless methods, and the growing desperation that gripped the land. There was talk of failed harvests, of cattle succumbing to disease, of a drought that had crippled the region for years. The ranch, once a symbol of Thorn's ruthless power, was faltering, its foundations cracking under the strain. An insidious truth began to unfold. Thorn wasn't just a master. He was a man consumed by his own failures. His cruelty, perhaps a desperate lashing out against a world he could no longer control. This knowledge, rather than offering comfort, only intensified the sense of peril. A cornered animal is often the most vicious, and Thorn, Ilara realized, was rapidly becoming cornered. The ranch, once a beacon of his tyrannical reign, was now a crumbling edifice, its inhabitants trapped within its decaying walls. She saw the irony, stark and unforgiving, in her own predicament, sold into a collapsing empire. The open loop of Jeremiah's mysterious past and intentions intertwined with the deepening mystery of Thorn's financial woes, creating a dense web of suspense that pulled at Ilara's frayed nerves. She found herself reflecting on the inherent injustice, the bitter truth that her fate was tied to the whims of a desperate, failing man. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of this impending collapse, a subtle tremor warning of a greater quake to come. The increasing tension on the ranch was palpable, a suffocating blanket woven from Thorn's growing desperation and the parched land's refusal to yield. His temper, once a controlled simmer, now boiled over with alarming frequency, fueled by his failing fortunes. Ilara moved with even greater caution, her senses heightened, every creak of the floorboards, every distant shout, a potential precursor to his wrath. The other workers, their faces etched with resignation, retreated further into themselves, their collective silence a testament to their long-suffering endurance. But Jeremiah remained a constant, unwavering presence, his quiet strength a stark contrast to the volatile chaos that now enveloped the ranch. He was an anchor in the storm, a silent witness to the unraveling threads of Thorn's empire. One evening, as the last rays of sun painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, Ilara was gathering kindling near the stables. She heard Thorn's voice, raised in a rare, furious outburst, directed at Jeremiah. The words were indistinct, but the venom in Thorn's tone was unmistakable. Then, a low, guttural growl from Jeremiah, a sound she had never heard him make, a primal utterance that spoke of suppressed fury. She froze, hidden by the shadows of the stable wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thorn's response was a sharp, cracking sound, followed by a grunt of pain from Jeremiah. Ilara gasped, a silent, choked sound. She risked a glance around the stable corner. Jeremiah was standing, his back to her, his shoulders squared, his frame unbowed. But Thorn was nursing his hand, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. He had struck Jeremiah, and Jeremiah had somehow resisted, perhaps even retaliated, in a way Thorn hadn't anticipated. It was a silent rebellion, a defiance that resonated through the still air. The scene was brief, a violent tableau against the dying light. Then Thorn stalked away, his heavy boots crunching angrily in the gravel. Jeremiah remained, unmoving, a statue carved from defiance. He was not just a worker, he was a force. Later, under the cloak of night, Ilara crept to the stable, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. She found Jeremiah tending to a horse, his movements as calm as ever, but she saw the slight tremor in his hand, the subtle flinch when he turned his head, revealing a fresh bruise blossoming on his cheekbone. Their eyes met in the dim light of the lantern. This time, there was no casual glance, no fleeting connection. His gaze held a profound weariness, but beneath it, a fierce, protective fire. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, the first word she had ever heard him direct at her. The land, it has its own justice. His words, sparse yet impactful, were weighted with meaning, echoing with the wisdom of the earth. They were not a warning, but a statement of immutable truth, a prophecy whispered into the night. It was a recognition of the impending storm, a shared acknowledgement of the inescapable fate that seemed to be closing in around them. This moment, raw and vulnerable, pulled back the curtain on Jeremiah's stoic facade, revealing the complex, flawed man beneath, capable of both immense suffering and quiet, unyielding strength. The tension in the air was thick, not just from Thorne's cruelty, but from the fragile, unspoken alliance that was quietly forming between them. The confrontation during the dust storm had irrevocably altered the landscape of their lives on the ranch. Thorne's possessive fury, momentarily contained by Jeremiah's silent defiance, now simmered beneath the surface, a festering wound. Elara felt its heat in every strained silence, in every fleeting, suspicious glance from the rancher. Her fear had sharpened into a desperate resolve. She knew, with chilling clarity, that she could not remain here. The ranch was no longer merely a prison, it was a cage, and the bars were closing in. Jeremiah, too, carried the weight of that unspoken agreement. His quiet, watchful gaze became a constant, a silent communication that spoke of plans forming, of an escape that was no longer merely a distant dream, but a desperate, tangible necessity. The stakes were impossibly high. Failure meant a fate worse than servitude, a complete erasure of their already fragile existence. One moonless night, the air thick with the scent of dry earth and distant thunder, Jeremiah approached Elara near the well. He didn't speak her name, merely beckoned with a subtle tilt of his head towards the darkness beyond the ranch fence. His eyes, in the faint starlight, shone with a quiet intensity, a reflection of the profound risks they were about to undertake. There was no grand speech, no dramatic declaration, just a shared understanding forged in adversity. He carried a small, worn satchel, its contents unknown, a symbol of their meager hopes. Elara, clutching the worn shawl that had become her constant companion, felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and exhilarating. This was it. This was the moment she had silently yearned for, and profoundly dreaded. The weight of her decision pressed down on her. The echoes of her grandmother's warnings about the vast, unforgiving world outside, juxtaposed against the suffocating reality of her present. They moved like wraiths under the cover of darkness, two shadows blending into the deeper shadows of the night. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl of a coyote, sounded like an alarm. The ranch house, a sleeping beast, loomed behind them, its windows dark, its silence oppressive. Elara's breath hitched in her throat as they slipped past the stables, the faint scent of horses a familiar comfort mixed with the potent tang of fear. Jeremiah led the way, his steps sure and silent, his knowledge of the land an intuitive map. He paused at the fence, his hands working quickly, expertly, to loosen a section of wire, creating a gap just wide enough for them to slip through. The metallic screech of the wire, though faint, seemed to rip through the stillness of the night, a harsh sound that resonated with the violence of their bid for freedom. As Elara squeezed through, her clothes catching on the sharp barbs, she felt a familiar ache, a sharp pang of remembrance for the home she had lost, the life that had been stripped from her. But beneath the pain, a fierce, defiant flicker of hope ignited. This was not a flight from, it was a desperate, terrifying lunge towards something unknown, something potentially better, a fragile whisper of a future. The cost of this freedom, she knew, would be immeasurable, paid in sweat, fear, and the enduring scars of their past. The vast, indifferent land stretched before them, a canvas of endless possibilities and terrifying uncertainties. They moved with a desperate urgency, propelled by the silent understanding that every step away from the ranch was a step closer to the precarious edge of a new beginning. The moon, a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, offered little light, forcing them to rely on Jeremiah's innate sense of direction, his body a compass in the wilderness. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, yet there was a tenderness in the way he occasionally glanced back at Elara, ensuring she kept pace, a silent reassurance that spoke louder than any words. The chill of the night seeped into their bones, but the cold external gave way to a deeper, internal warmth, a fragile ember of hope flickering in the face of immense danger. The air was thick with the scent of sage and damp earth, punctuated by the rustle of unseen creatures, every sound a potential threat. They walked for hours, the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the dry earth the only sound, a stark counterpoint to the pounding of Ilara's heart. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but the fear of being caught, of being dragged back to Thorn's desolate prison, spurred her onward. Flashbacks, fleeting and fragmented, assaulted her mind. The calculating gaze of the auctioneer, the cold, dismissive hand of the rancher, the suffocating silence of her forced servitude. Each memory was a whip, driving her forward, reminding her of the life she was escaping, the indignity she refused to endure a moment longer. Jeremiah, ever vigilant, scanned the horizon, his silhouette a stoic guardian against the vastness. He was a man of few words, his language spoken through action and the quiet steadfastness of his presence. His strength was a silent anchor, a profound contrast to the boisterous, empty threats of the men who had sought to own them. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with faint streaks of rose and gray, they found a small, hidden alcove beneath an overhang of rock, barely visible from the distance. It was a temporary reprieve, a fragile sanctuary in the sprawling wilderness. They huddled together, the meager warmth of their bodies a small comfort against the morning chill. Jeremiah offered Ilara a piece of dried meat from his satchel, a simple gesture of sustenance that felt like a profound act of care. As she ate, her hunger a gnawing void, she met his gaze. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a deep, unreadable sadness, but also a flicker of fierce determination. There was a story behind those eyes, a personal history of struggle and resilience that mirrored her own. She wanted to ask, to unravel the mystery of his silence, but the moment was not for questions. It was for survival, for the quiet acknowledgement of their shared plight. They were two lost souls, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, but now they were adrift together. The symbolism of the open, untamed land became palpable, a representation of their newfound terrifying freedom, a vast expanse both promising and punishing. The journey was far from over. It was only just beginning, a terrifying, beautiful unfolding into the unknown. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of walking, hiding, and the gnawing anxiety of discovery. The desert, unforgiving and vast, became both their tormentor and their unlikely protector, its harsh beauty concealing them from the world they had fled. Ilara's feet ached, her clothes were ragged, but her spirit, once a shattered vessel, began to mend, piece by agonizing piece. Jeremiah remained her silent guardian, his every action a testament to his quiet resolve. He knew the land, its hidden springs, its treacherous turns, guiding them with an unwavering certainty that transcended mere navigation. His movements, though weary, retained their graceful efficiency, a testament to a life lived in harmony with the wild. Their bond deepened with each shared sunrise, and every perilous night, a silent covenant forged in the crucible of desperation. They reached a small, forgotten settlement nestled beside a winding river, a cluster of ramshackle cabins and a solitary store, a place barely clinging to existence on the fringes of civilization. It was a haven, however temporary, a fragile promise of respite. The people they encountered were wary, their faces etched with the hardships of their own lives. But there was an underlying current of shared understanding, a quiet acceptance of two weary travelers seeking refuge. They found odd jobs, meager work that provided enough for a course meal and a corner to rest. Ilara cleaned, mended, her hands finding a new purpose beyond servitude. Jeremiah, with his innate skill with horses, found work in the stables, his quiet competence speaking volumes where words were few. They rarely spoke of Thorn, of the ranch, or of the terror they had escaped. Those memories were a shared, unspoken burden, a silent scar that bound them closer than any blood tie. The past was a shadow that followed them, a constant reminder of the price of their precarious freedom. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Ilara and Jeremiah sat by the river, the gentle murmur of the water a soothing balm. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a depth she was only beginning to fathom. "This," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, gesturing to the flowing water, to the vast expanse of the sky. "This is our own." His words, simple yet profound, resonated with the weight of their journey, the struggle, the fear, and the hard-won peace. It was not a declaration of love, nor a promise of eternal safety, but a recognition of their shared autonomy, their ownership of their own uncertain future. Ilara felt a quiet strength bloom within her, a resilient seed nurtured by the unforgiving soil of her past. Their future was not guaranteed. The echoes of injustice still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the world they inhabited. But they had each other, a silent promise of solidarity against the vast indifference of the world. The resolution was not a triumphant roar, but a hopeful sigh, a quiet, grounded affirmation that even in the darkest of times, two shattered souls could find a flicker of light, a path forward, together, into a horizon of uncertain hope. The struggle had not ended. It had merely shifted, transformed into a continuous, quiet act of living, of choosing freedom, day by arduous day.